My name is Kristin Davidsson, and I got involved within Impact and this environmental module a couple of months ago. And I also work with our energy calculation programs here at Studisoft. Okay, so let's talk about the environmental module. And for those of you who have been here previous years at the user conference, you have heard my colleague Christopher talk about the 2 Swedish research projects that we have been involved with regarding life cycle assessments of prefabricated building elements. And these 2 research projects, they lay the foundation for this module. This module is a digitalized tool to calculate the environmental impact with life cycle assessment and represented as CO2 emissions here in the module, like we will see. Okay, so the first question you may ask yourself is, why should we calculate the environmental impact in PM, in impact? And my answer to that is, since you have already defined your project, the entire project is defined in PM. You know which building elements are in the project, you know what materials there are, you know the volumes, and all this information is actually the information that is used in environmental calculations. So why not use this information to calculate? And by having these calculations early in the planning process means that we can hopefully reduce the emissions. And my fourth point here, an example from Sweden, is that in 2022, a climate declaration, eller en klimatdeklaration, will be required for a new building project. This will take place in 2022. And this climate declaration, means just an environmental calculation, like we will see. And we will see how we can calculate that in impact. When talking about life cycle assessment, we have 3 different stages, like we will see here. The first stage is the production stage, which is, and that covers the emissions that are emitting during the gathering of the raw materials for the building elements. We have transport to and from the factory where these elements will be produced. And we have the emissions that are emitted during the construction of the building. And these 5 steps are included in the production stage. And if we move on to the use stage instead, which is the part when the building is constructed, and this phase, the use stage, that will last for a long period of time, since the building will last for many, many years. And the last stage is the end of time stage, which is when the building is used, and now we will have deconstruction instead, and disposal of the building parts. And if we think, which of these stages and which steps do we have information about in PM? Yes, we have information about the first 3 points in the production stage. We know which building elements are used, so we have information about the raw materials. We know which factory are in use in this project, and we know where the factory are located geographically. So we have information about the factory consumption, and so on. And this information is the one that we will use in the environmental calculation And this is also the information that will be included in this climate declaration. And since we can calculate the raw material, the transport, and the emissions from the factory consumption, we can calculate that each part separately. We can see which of the steps have the biggest share of the CO2 emissions. So for the users to be able to calculate this in the module, you need to define your concrete composition, the concrete recipe. What are the different components in the recipe? And after that, when you have defined your concrete recipe, you also need to define what reinforcement are used. We need to define what are the components and materials in our casting materials. And we need to define which insulation is used in exactly this project. And the third thing you need to define is information about the factory consumption. How much energy, how much heat is used in this factory to produce the elements, what waste will be produced, transport. Now when we have information about the building elements, we have we have inserted information about the concrete recipe, what reinforcement we are used. So now we need to calculate. And in order to calculate, we have a connection to a company called Bionova and their tool One-Click LCA, which is a company and a tool where you, which calculates life cycle assessment calculations. One-Click LCA offers a set of services for companies and organizations to meet their sustainability goals. And with their tools, for example, you can perform BREEAM and LEED certifications. So we'll calculate, we click calculate in the module. We send a request to One-Click LCA to perform the calculation, and we receive the result back, which is presented as CO2 emissions in the module. So now we will have a demo to see how this workflow, how it works and how the module looks like. So I open my project manager. No. Okay, so now we are in project manager. I have my project here and I have opened the module, the environmental module. So I open define materials to start defining my concrete recipe. So I take the first tab, and here I have the concrete in my standard. So here I choose from the list of resources, and these resources are they are included in the database with environmental data from One-Click LCA, which is they have many databases with a lot of environmental data. So I choose here and sort what insulation, what cement do I have in this project. I choose one, and after that I start to defining my recipe with the different components. Okay, so when I am finished with defining my concrete, I continue to the next tab, which is the factory consumption. I define a time period, a factory period, and here as well I choose from the list of resources. And here we need to define, for example, what electricity are used and what waste are produced in this process. So I choose one here. I have electricity, and I add the amount of kilowatt hours that was produced during this time. Now I only insert electricity, but in another case, I add more things, of course. And the last thing is the other materials. I choose, for example, my insulation, mineral wool. Here I define what mineral wool are I using in this project. I choose from the list of resources. And here we can see that I first choose a subtype of what kind of material do I want to choose from. And depending on which subtype, I get different resources along this. Okay, so now I have defined the materials in this project. I close this dialog. And after that, it's time to calculate. I press the calculate button. So now the request is sent to one-click LCA. The calculation goes on. And here I get summary of the building elements. Okay, so here I see the result, how many ton CO2 emissions were emitted during this project. And now, of course, I can open my defined materials again and insert more components and see how that affects my result. If I want to, I can also click here, and then I will continue. Go to one-click LCA and their web service. I can study the result in more detail and see which of these emissions came from the raw materials, the factory consumptions, and the separate ones. And I can also fill in more in data to complete an entire EPD and go the whole life cycle. So you define the materials and then calculate, and then you have the calculation, the result. Oh. And here is one more slide. And if we go from left to right, and I will explain the different bars. The first bar is when I have 100% cement in my concrete. That is, of course, not reasonable, but I get a lot of emissions. So in the second bar, I start to define my concrete recipe. These are the components I have in the recipe. The third bar, I add the reinforcement to see how that affects the emissions. And in the fourth bar, I also include my insulation. And in that way, you can test different alternatives to see how that affects the emissions. And to find a result that reflects the reality. So this is the workflow of the new environmental module. Okay, so thank you so much. And of course, feel free to contact me if you have any further questions afterwards. And just send me an email or give me a call.